When Clint Eastwood stopped, standing in front of a crowded art booth on the city sidewalk, most people didn't even notice this man. But when he held a painting and listened attentively to the bald girl with a pale face in front of the booth, selling these paintings was the only and last way to save her own life, making Clint Eastwood decide to act now, and that very moment changed the girl's future forever. Sophie Carter sat on the hospital bed, her frail fingers absent-mindedly tracing invisible patterns on the wrinkled sheets, each crease a silent echo of her struggles. The air was thick with the sharp scent of antiseptic, a sterile reminder of the relentless battle she was waging. The dim light from the overhead fixture cast elongated shadows on the dull beige walls, making the room feel smaller, suffocating. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths as she clenched her fingers together, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She stared at the door, waiting, dreading Dr. Patel's arrival. When the door finally creaked open, she flinched, her gaze snapping up to meet the doctor's solemn expression. His usual measured demeanor remained, but there was a weight behind his words that made her stomach twist into knots. "Sophie, your treatment is working," he said, his voice calm, carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had delivered too much bad news to too many people. He attempted a small smile, but it barely lifted the corners of his lips. "But you will need 3 more rounds of chemotherapy before we can consider sending you home." Sophie exhaled, her breath shaky. Relief flickered through her veins like a dying ember, but before she could embrace it, she noticed the hesitation in Dr. Patel's eyes. He shifted his weight, adjusting the clipboard in his hands, as if stalling for time. "I need to be honest with you," he said, his voice quieter now. "Your insurance will not cover the next rounds of treatment. The cost will be significant." The words landed like a physical blow. A hollow ache bloomed in her chest as she swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Beside her, her father stiffened, his hands clenched into fists on his lap, the muscles in his forearms tightening as he fought to keep his composure. A faint tremor ran through his fingers before he exhaled through his nose, his jaw locking into place. He had already sacrificed so much, sold their second car, taken a second job, drained their savings. The weight of his exhaustion was carved into the deep lines on his face. Her mother sat frozen, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned bone white. She pressed her lips together, blinking rapidly, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Her fingers twitched as if she wanted to reach out, to comfort Sophie, but they remained rigid in her lap, gripping onto an invisible thread of control. For the first time since her diagnosis, Sophie felt something heavier than fear. It was guilt, thick, suffocating. She wasn't just fighting cancer. She was watching it drain the life from the people she loved most. The exhaustion in her father's eyes, the quiet desperation trembling in her mother's voice. It was unbearable. The thought of her parents losing everything just to keep her alive sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her stomach. The idea of dying was terrifying, but the thought of leaving them drowning in debt was worse. The drive home was wrapped in silence. Her father's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned ghostly pale. His lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, his shoulders squared in tense determination. The car's interior was dimly lit by the glow of passing streetlights, each flicker casting sharp angles across his weary face. Her mother sat beside her, her voice soft, gentle words meant to soothe floating between them. But Sophie heard it, the tremor, the strain in each syllable. They weren't words of comfort. They were lifelines, desperately thrown out in a sea of uncertainty. Sophie stared out the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she clenched her fists in her lap. She knew the truth. Her mother's reassurances weren't meant for her. They were meant to keep them all from breaking. That night, she lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with thoughts she couldn't silence. It wasn't death that frightened her most. It was the thought of watching her parents sacrifice everything, draining their savings, losing their home, struggling under the weight of a debt they could never repay. All for her. She clenched her fists, her nails pressing into her palms. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't. Then, like a whisper in the dark, a memory surfaced. The scent of acrylic paint, the smooth glide of a brush over canvas, colors blending into something beautiful, something uniquely hers. Art had always been her escape, her refuge in the chaos. But now, could it be more than that? Could it be her way forward? A quote flickered in her mind, one she had read in an interview long ago, but never truly understood until now. I don't believe in pessimism. If something doesn't come up the way you want, forge ahead. If you think it's going to rain, it will. The words rooted themselves deep within her, igniting something she hadn't felt in weeks, a spark of determination, of defiance against the odds. As the first rays of sunlight stretched through her window, Sophie sat at her tiny desk, fingers trembling around a paintbrush. She hesitated only for a moment, then inhaled deeply, grounding herself. The first stroke was tentative, the second steadier. As the colors melted together beneath her touch, something within her shifted. This wasn't just about painting anymore. She was carving out her future, one brushstroke at a time. Her father had woken up at dawn to help her set up before heading to his grueling day job. He had been quiet that morning, only offering her a small, reassuring squeeze on the shoulder before he left. Sophie knew he wanted to do more, but they were both painfully aware that everything depended on her now. Sophie Carter arranged her paintings meticulously on the foldable table, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted each frame to catch the light just right. The bustling city street was alive with energy, tourists snapping photos, street musicians strumming their guitars, and business people hurrying past without a second glance. Sophie inhaled deeply, forcing herself to believe that today would be different. Today, someone would see her work, really see it, and decide that it was worth something. She sat down, clutching a paintbrush in her lap like a talisman. This wasn't just about selling art. This was about survival. Every brushstroke, every line, every color on her canvas represented a fight against the illness that threatened to consume her. But as the morning passed, reality settled in. People walked by, some sparing a glance, others not even bothering to look. A woman in an elegant suit stopped for a moment, reading the small sign Sophie had carefully written. Artwork for sale. Raising funds for cancer treatment. Sophie's heart leaped with hope, but the woman only sighed softly, as if pitying her, and walked away without a word. Sophie bit her lip, pushing away the sting of disappointment. Hours passed under the scorching sun. Her body, already weak from the effects of chemotherapy, ached from sitting too long. She wiped the sweat from her brow, her fingers smudging paint across her forehead. But she refused to leave. She had promised herself she wouldn't give up. Then, finally, a change. An elderly couple approached, the woman's gaze drawn to a painting of Jesus standing on an endless field of golden grass, his arms outstretched beneath a glowing sunset. The old woman's eyes softened as she reached out, her fingers hovering over the textured brushstrokes. "This is beautiful," she murmured. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you." Her husband glanced at the price tag. $95, huh? Sophie nodded, barely breathing as the woman looked at her husband, then back at the painting. Then, with a warm smile, she pulled out her wallet. We'll take it. For a moment, Sophie couldn't move. She had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was happening, it felt unreal. If you believe God will bless Sophie, please hit the like button or comment below and continue listening to the whole story. Her fingers shook as she carefully wrapped the painting, her heart pounding with gratitude. When the couple walked away, she clutched the bills in her hand, holding them tightly, as if they might disappear. But the world around her remained unchanged. The street musicians played on, the tourists laughed, the business people rushed past. She was still just another vendor on the sidewalk, another person trying to be seen. More people stopped to look, but none committed to buying. A man in a sleek black suit paused, offering her an encouraging nod. "You're brave," he said, before disappearing into the crowd. Sophie didn't feel brave. She felt exhausted. A woman in a red dress studied her display, before shaking her head with a smirk. "No one buys real paintings anymore," she scoffed. "Try Instagram or TikTok." Sophie's grip tightened around the edge of the table, but she kept her voice steady. "I don't have that option. I have to fight in the only way I know how." By the 5th day, her body screamed for rest. Her fingers cramped from holding brushes too long, and the nausea from her treatments made every hour feel longer than the last. She had only sold one painting. One. And it wasn't nearly enough. Doubt crept in, whispering that the woman in red had been right. Maybe no one cared about paintings anymore. Maybe this was all for nothing. Then, as she was about to pack up for the day, someone stopped. A man, early 30s, dressed casually but with a certain air of importance, studied her display with keen interest. He pulled out a small notebook, scribbled something down, then met her gaze. "Are you the artist?" he asked. "Yes." Sophie's voice was hoarse, almost hesitant. He smiled slightly. "I'm a reporter for CNN. Your story might be worth telling." Her breath caught. Could this be it? Could this be the moment that changed everything? She didn't dare to hope. But deep down, something in her heart whispered, maybe, just maybe, the fight wasn't over yet. Sophie's breath hitched as the reporter's words settled in. A story. Her story. She had spent so long fighting in quiet desperation, hoping someone would notice. And now, perhaps, her voice might finally be heard. The reporter knelt down beside her makeshift booth, his gaze lingering on one particular painting, a breathtaking sunset bleeding across a field of wildflowers. "Did you paint all of these yourself?" he asked, his voice tinged with admiration. Sophie nodded, swallowing hard. Every single one. He pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the artwork, then another of the small handwritten sign that explained her mission. "I run an art blog," he said, "but I also write for CNN's Human Interest section. Your story needs to be shared." Sophie's heart pounded. Could this be real? Could someone finally be willing to tell her story, to amplify her plea for help? He pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a fresh page. "Tell me about your journey, Sophie. How did you end up here?" She hesitated for only a moment, before the words came pouring out. About the endless hospital visits, the mounting medical bills, the guilt of watching her parents struggle under the weight of it all. She spoke of the nights she lay awake, wondering if she had the right to keep fighting when the cost was so high. By the time she finished, the reporter was quiet, nodding as he jotted down notes. "I'm going to do my best to get this published," he said finally. "People need to hear this. You deserve a chance." Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them back. her lips pressing together in a determined smile. "Thank you." The next morning, everything changed. Sophie's phone buzzed nonstop with notifications. A message from her best friend contained a link. Fighting with Art, the teen using paint to fund her chemotherapy. The article had gone viral overnight. Hundreds, no, thousands, of comments flooded the post. "Sophie is a warrior. We're with you. She's an inspiration to young artists everywhere. How can I buy a painting?" By noon, people crowded around her little booth, each one eager to support her mission. Strangers handed her money, bought her artwork, and some simply offered words of encouragement. The exhaustion she had felt for days was replaced by an electrifying sense of hope. She sold more paintings in those few hours than she had in the past week combined. Each sale was a step closer to affording her treatment, to relieving her parents of some of the burden. But as she took in the overwhelming support, she knew she still had a long way to go. And she had no idea that an even bigger moment was on the horizon. Someone was coming. Someone who could change everything. Saturday morning, the streets are more bustling with laughter than any other day before. Hurried footsteps, the distant hum of a saxophone. But for Sophie, time seemed to slow. A strange hush settled around her, an invisible force pulling her attention toward a lone figure moving deliberately through the crowd. Unlike the restless passers-by, he didn't rush. He didn't glance at his phone. He simply moved with a presence that demanded notice. A tall, older man, draped in a worn leather jacket and a well-loved cowboy hat, approached her booth. His piercing gaze roamed over each painting, lingering on the brushstrokes, the colors, the details that so many had overlooked. He studied them, not with the casual curiosity of a shopper, but with the quiet reverence of someone who understood. Sophie swallowed, her throat dry. She had spoken to dozens of potential customers that week, yet something about this man made her words catch in her chest. Summoning her voice, she asked, "Do you see anything you like?" The man turned his head, a slow, measured movement, and a knowing smile played at the corners of his weathered lips. "I'm more interested in the story behind them," he said, his voice deep, rich with the weight of years and untold stories. For the second time that week, Sophie found herself unraveling her past. She spoke of the diagnosis that had upended her world, the sterile hospital rooms where she had battled exhaustion and uncertainty, the mountain of medical bills that threatened to bury her family. And most of all, she spoke of her art, how it had become her salvation, her way of reclaiming control in a life that had spun wildly beyond her grasp. The man listened, not with pity, nor with the detached politeness Sophie had come to expect from strangers, but with a quiet intensity. He nodded occasionally, his expression unreadable, until at last he reached for one of her paintings. It wasn't one of the grand landscapes that many admired, or the striking sunsets that drew attention. It was a small, unassuming still life, a ripe yellow banana affixed to a stark white background, a study in simplicity, a moment frozen in time. "How much for this one?" he asked, his voice steady. Sophie hesitated. $200, she said softly, bracing for the familiar sting of rejection. But instead of reaching for his wallet, the man pulled out an old iPhone, its edges worn, its screen bearing the scratches of time. "Give me your bank details," he said. Sophie blinked, caught off guard. Slowly, hesitantly, she recited the numbers. A moment later, her phone vibrated. She pulled it from her pocket, and the world tilted beneath her feet. Not $200, 200,000. Her breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she wiped her eyes, convinced it was a mistake, a cruel trick played by exhaustion or the lingering side effects of chemotherapy. But the digits remained, solid and undeniable. She looked up at the man, her voice barely a whisper. There must be some mistake. I can't accept this." A low chuckle rumbled from his chest as he tilted his head. "No mistake, kid," he said. "That painting's worth every cent." The crowd, once oblivious, had begun to take notice. A murmur rippled through them, hushed voices building into gasps of recognition. "Is that Clint Eastwood?" Sophie's heart pounded. Clint Eastwood, the living legend, the man whose weathered face had graced screens for generations, whose words had unknowingly given her hope during her darkest days. She struggled to speak. But why? Clint glanced at the banana painting, his expression softening in a way that seemed almost out of place for a man of his stature. "When I was a kid, we didn't have much," he murmured. "Some nights, the only thing we had to eat was an overripe banana I'd find somewhere. Your painting took me back. Art does that. It reminds us where we came from." The crowd surged closer, cameras flashing, voices whispering in awe. Strangers suddenly clamored to buy Sophie's paintings, eager to be part of something extraordinary. She stood frozen, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. Clint met her gaze one last time. "You've got something special," he said. "Don't stop painting." Sophie stood amidst the whirlwind of voices and flashing lights, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something beyond gratitude. She felt hope, and in that moment she realized this was only the beginning. A teenage girl walking by with her headphones in suddenly stopped mid-step. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in disbelief as she tugged at her friend's sleeve. "Wait, is that Clint Eastwood?" she murmured, her voice barely above a breath, yet thick with shock. Nearby, a man in a crisp business suit faltered, his coffee sloshing dangerously near the rim of his cup. He turned, blinking, as if confirming what his eyes had just registered. His gaze darted between the legendary actor and the humble booth adorned with paintings. Then, almost instinctively, he pulled out his phone and hit record. The whispers multiplied, growing into an excited hum. More heads turned, more eyes widened. A college student balancing a stack of books nearly dropped them as he yanked his friend's sleeve, pointing frantically. Within moments, the mundane street scene had transformed into something extraordinary. "Oh my God, that's Clint Eastwood. He's buying a painting? What is happening?" A voice gasped from the swelling crowd. Phones shot up, capturing the moment, thumbs flying across screens as texts and tweets flooded cyberspace. A woman in a tailored blazer, who had previously strode past Sophie's booth without a second glance, suddenly doubled back, her sharp eyes narrowing in curiosity. "Wait, he just bought a painting?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Then, the explosion. A shriek erupted from the center of the growing cluster. $200,000? The words detonated like a firework, sending a jolt of energy through the throng. Gasps, murmurs. The air vibrated with disbelief and exhilaration. And then, chaos ensued. "I'll take this one." A woman lunged forward, snatching a painting without hesitation, her fingers fumbling through her purse for cash. "How much is this?" a man demanded, flipping through Sophie's remaining collection with a kind of desperate urgency. One by one, the paintings that had sat untouched for days were suddenly being scooped up, hands grabbing, voices calling out, wallets opening without a second thought. There were no negotiations, no hesitation, only pure, unfiltered desire to own a piece of something extraordinary. A young boy, barely 10, tugged at his father's sleeve, eyes shining with urgency. "Dad, I need cash. I have to get one before they're all gone." Sophie sat frozen, her breath caught somewhere between shock and awe, as her small booth became the epicenter of a storm she never saw coming. It felt surreal, like she was standing outside of herself, watching someone else's dream unfold. In the eye of it all, Clint Eastwood remained steady, an immovable force amid the frenzy. While the world around him spun into chaos, he stood with an air of quiet amusement, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his weathered leather jacket, his piercing eyes watching everything unfold with a knowing expression. Then, with the ease of a man who had seen it all, he leaned in slightly, his voice low and gravelly, meant only for Sophie's ears. "I told you, kid, keep painting." A subtle tap of his hat, a nod of farewell, and then, just as effortlessly as he had arrived, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sophie standing in the whirlwind of a world forever changed. By the time Sophie made it home that evening, her phone was a battlefield of notifications. Hundreds, no, thousands, of messages poured in, each vibrating with energy, each echoing the same emotions: awe, support, admiration. News outlets lit up with headlines: "Clint Eastwood buys struggling artist's painting for $200,000, and his reason will leave you speechless." "Hollywood legend changes young artist's life with one act of kindness." Everywhere, the same image: Clint Eastwood standing beside her tiny booth, holding the small banana painting, a moment now immortalized forever. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, the entire internet had turned its gaze upon her. And then came the messages from people all over the world. "Sophie, I want to buy one of your paintings. Do you ship to California? My son is fighting cancer too. You give us hope." Sophie's breath hitched as she scrolled, her fingers trembling. This wasn't just about selling art anymore. This was something bigger, something unstoppable. And Sophie Carter, the girl who had once feared she was invisible, finally realized something profound. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Sophie was stirred awake by the soft chime of an email notification. The golden light of dawn streamed through her window, casting warm patterns on her walls. Blinking against the brightness, she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly. As her eyes adjusted to the screen, her breath hitched. Gallery West, California. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a drum of anticipation. Swallowing hard, she tapped the email open, her pulse hammering, as she read the words that would change her life. "Dear Ms. Carter, we have been following your incredible journey and are deeply moved by your story. It would be our honor to feature your artwork in our upcoming exhibition, representing you as an artist who embodies resilience and passion. We would love to discuss this opportunity further." A sharp inhale. Sophie pressed a hand to her chest, as if to steady the racing rhythm beneath her fingertips. Her lips parted in disbelief. This wasn't just about selling paintings anymore. She wasn't just a girl on the sidewalk trying to survive. She was an artist, a symbol of perseverance, a storyteller with a brush in her hand. 3 weeks later, Sophie stepped into the hospital for what she knew would be her final round of chemotherapy. But this time, she carried something new with her: certainty. The suffocating weight of unpaid bills and looming debts had vanished. Each financial burden that once threatened to drown her had been erased by the strokes of her own paintbrush, by one unexpected encounter, by one man who had seen her, truly seen her. As she settled into the reclining chair, the familiar scent of antiseptic filled her nose. The fourth line was inserted with practiced ease, the cold sensation snaking up her arm. She let her head rest against the cushion exhaling slowly. The treatment still sapped her strength, still drained the color from her cheeks, but fear no longer held her captive. Because beyond these walls, beyond the fluorescent lights and sterile halls, a future awaited, a future she had fought for, one brushstroke at a time. A week after her final treatment, a thick envelope arrived at her doorstep. The paper felt expensive, the ink bold, yet elegant. Sophie's fingers trembled as she slid a letter opener beneath the flap, her breath catching as she pulled out the handwritten note inside. Dear Sophie, your fight reminds me that there are stories still worth telling. Never stop telling yours. Clint. A sob caught in her throat. She traced the ink with her fingers, as if the words carried weight beyond the paper. It wasn't just a letter. It was an unspoken promise. A connection forged, not by fame or fortune, but by something deeper. A shared understanding that the world needed stories of resilience, of courage, of hope. Her first exhibition was only days away. Each time she opened her inbox, new messages flooded in, buyers, collectors, admirers. The momentum was unstoppable, her name now whispered with reverence in art circles she had never imagined reaching. Yet, amid all the paintings soon to be displayed, amid the offers she would accept, and the pieces she would let go, there was one she would never sell. A black and white painting of Clint Eastwood, riding his horse across the vast untamed West, his silhouette fading into the horizon. And as for the banana painting, that one belonged to Clint now, a testament to resilience, to kindness unexpected, and to the unshakable belief that sometimes art doesn't just tell a story, it rewrites one. Because it had rewritten hers. Sophie thanks you. She knows that you are one of the thousands who liked and shared this story, just like the thousands who shared her story, and your small actions could save her life, or someone in this world that you may never meet. And if you like similar stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story about someone else. Maybe not Sophia.